February 1943. The North African desert looked endless, a sea of ochre and heat where sound vanished into sand. The air shimmered above the dunes, the horizon bent like a mirage, and the smell of burnt oil lingered long after the gun stopped. Sergeant Frank Miller leaned against the turret of his M4 Sherman, wiping a film of dust from his goggles. He could feel the metal radiating the sun's fury through his gloves. They had been fighting for 2 days near Kasserine Pass, and every mile of this desert felt like the inside of a furnace. The Germans were Ghost's Panzer IVs that appeared out of the haze, fired once, and disappeared again. The Americans never saw them until it was too late. Frank's gunner, Private Allen, crouched beside the tank, checking the breech of the 75mm gun. The barrel was coated in fine sand, the rifling packed with grit. He muttered something under his breath about how the desert wasn't built for machines. Frank didn't answer. He was thinking about the last Sherman that tried to flank the ridge an hour ago. It had taken a single round from a Panzer at almost a mile and vanished in a column of black smoke. Inside, 5 men who had been joking over rations that morning were now names on a clipboard. They had fired back dozens of shells, but the sand betrayed them. The rounds struck the ground short of their targets, throwing up fountains of dust that blinded the gunners and gave away their position. The tanks that survived were pulled back into the shadow of a low escarpment where even the wind felt tired. The radio hissed with static, and the voices coming through were grim. Hold position. Wait for orders. Frank knew what that meant. Wait until someone else died first. He watched the sun crawl toward the horizon, each minute stretching like a punishment. The heat distorted everything, the shapes of the dunes, the sound of the engines, even time itself. The Germans had the high ground and the range. The Shermans had armor that could barely stop a 37mm shell, let alone an 88. Each man knew the math. A Tiger could kill them at 2,000 yards. They had to get within 500 just to make a dent. That wasn't a tactic, that was suicide in equations. Frank reached inside his jacket, pulled out a folded photograph of his wife, and stared at it for a moment before tucking it back. He didn't think about glory or medals. He thought about how the manuals back home never mentioned sand heat or fear. He thought about how the textbook said, "Fire from hull down position," as if that meant something when the ground itself swallowed your shots. The manuals didn't mention what to do when every rule failed. The desert didn't care about doctrine. It didn't care about courage. It devoured both. As the light began to fade, Frank looked across the camp and saw Allen staring at the ground, sketching lines in the sand with a stick angles arcs as numbers. The kid had been a physics student before the war. He said something Frank almost didn't catch. Maybe it's not about power. Maybe it's about the angle. Frank turned to look at him, then at the scarred dunes stretching before them. Somewhere beyond that horizon, German barrels waited in perfect geometry, hidden in silence. He wondered if angles could really save men from machines. That night the wind rose again, carrying the hiss of moving sand across empty steel hulls. The tank slept. The men didn't. Each thought about the next morning, the next order, the next shot that might not come back. And in that uneasy quiet, Frank realized something no manual had ever taught him. Survival wasn't just about stronger armor or a bigger gun. It was about thinking faster than the desert. He whispered to Allen before turning in, "Tomorrow we change the math." By dawn, the desert was already glowing white. The wind had dropped, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against the eardrums. The men called it the hour of ghosts, when you could hear your own heartbeat louder than the engines. Frank climbed onto the hull of his Sherman and scanned the ridge through binoculars. Nothing moved, but he knew they were there. Somewhere beyond those sand folds, German armor was waiting perfectly still, perfectly hidden. The Afrika Korps didn't need to rush. They had range experience and the ground on their side. The Americans had been in North Africa barely 3 months. Most of the crews were still learning how to coordinate tank and infantry movement in open terrain. Their radios failed half the time, their engines overheated, and their ammunition performed unpredictably under the desert heat. Frank could smell diesel mixed with burned rubber, a sour perfume of exhaustion that had become the scent of the campaign. The supply trucks hadn't arrived for 2 days. Food was sand-colored biscuits and tepid water that tasted of metal. Every man's uniform carried a permanent crust of salt from dried sweat. At 0800 hours, the first enemy shells landed 200 yards short, kicking up pillars of dust that glittered in the sun. The crews ducked instinctively, even knowing the rounds were off. Then came the whistle of another volley, closer this time. One shell struck an ammunition truck behind them, and the explosion rolled through the valley like thunder. The air shimmered orange with burning fuel. Over the intercom, someone cursed and shouted for coordinates. No one had any. They couldn't even see where the fire was coming from. "Panzer IV is on the ridge, 1 o'clock." Alan's voice cracked through the headset. Frank turned the turret and saw it barely a flicker of light off armor, then another, and then the flash of a muzzle. He called out ranges, but even before they could aim, the German shell hit. The shock slammed through the ground, rattling the Sherman suspension. They were lucky it landed short, but the message was clear: the enemy could reach them, and they couldn't answer back. Frank ordered smoke shells fired to cover withdrawal. As the white clouds blossomed, the column retreated half a mile to regroup behind a ridge. Inside the tank, sweat ran down their backs like oil. No one spoke. Each man stared at the empty casing scattered on the floor at the sand, crawling through every gap in the armor plates. When the dust settled, the reality hit. They were down to 7 operational tanks. The rest were burning wrecks scattered across the plain. Over the radio, higher command insisted they hold the line, as if the line wasn't already ashes. Frank listened to the static and switched the set off. Orders were easy when you weren't inside a steel coffin. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the dunes, they counted what was left: 18 shells, 3 working engines, no reinforcements. Alan sat on the ground cleaning the 75-millimeter barrel with a rag soaked in kerosene. His hands were shaking slightly from fatigue, but his voice was steady. "We keep hitting the same armor plate," he said, "and we expect different results." Frank frowned. "You got a better idea?" "Not yet, but I've been thinking about the rounds that hit the sand. Some of them bounce. I saw one skip off the ground this morning and disappear into the haze. What if it doesn't stop a tiger?" Alan nodded, staring at the sand like it might answer him. Maybe not, but it might stop something. The night brought no relief. The wind changed, blowing hot air from the south, carrying fine grains that seeped into every seam of the tank. Frank lay awake on the engine deck, staring at the stars that looked too bright to belong to the same world as the battlefield. He thought about the words in the field manual: "Maintain spacing, advance by, fire, suppress the enemy." None of it meant anything out here. Out here doctrine was suicide printed on good paper. He remembered the face of Captain Rogers, the one who had drilled those words into them back in Fort Knox. Fire Discipline Miller. You win by the book. But the book hadn't mentioned terrain that swallowed shells or German gunners who could hit a coin at 1,000 yards. The book didn't plead. Before dawn, Frank checked the horizon again. The German tanks had repositioned closer overnight. Their silhouettes were darker now against the pale sky. He could almost feel the enemy's confidence, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're winning. He spat into the sand, watching the moisture vanish instantly. "They've got better guns, better ground, better everything," he muttered. "All we've got is stubborn." Alan was already awake, hunched over his notebook. Lines, numbers, sketches. He looked up when Frank approached. "If the sand can deflect, we can use it. The surface is soft, but it still transfers force. If the shell hits at an angle, say 20 degrees, it could skip upward, change trajectory, and strike the side armor. It's just geometry." Frank stared at him. "You're talking about using the desert as a weapon." "I'm saying it's the only thing here that doesn't run out of ammunition." They both laughed quietly, though it wasn't really funny. Alan closed his notebook. "Tomorrow let me test it." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Tomorrow we're supposed to die anyway. Might as well die trying something new." The wind picked up again, blowing through the empty wrecks that dotted the ridge like metal tombstones. In that sound, Frank heard the desert whisper back, "The truth, nothing lasts here. Not orders, not armor, only ideas." He looked at Alan and said, "You get one chance, kid. Make the sand fight for us." The desert had a way of hiding its secrets until someone was desperate enough to listen. That night, long after the camp lights went out, Alan was still awake. The moon was a thin blade hanging over the dunes, barely bright enough to see by, but the reflection on the tank barrels shimmered like glass. Frank watched from the shadow of his Sherman as Alan dragged an ammunition crate into the open. Inside were 3 remaining practice rounds, low-charge shells, meant for training, not battle. "You're going to wake the whole division," Frank whispered. Alan shook his head. No division left to wake. He knelt in the sand and began tracing lines with a stick, a slope, an angle, a parabola. His handwriting looked like the sketches of a man half scientist, half dreamer. "The Germans use precision," he murmured. "We can't match that. But maybe we can use imperfection." Frank crouched beside him. Imperfection. Alan gestured toward the dunes. "Look at it. Nothing here is straight. It's all curves and slopes. That's why our shells dig in, they hit soft, they lose energy. But if the angle's right..." He held his hand out flat and tilted it slightly. "The shell won't dig. It'll glance." Frank frowned. "You think a shell's just going to bounce back up like a rock on a pond?" "Maybe not back up. Maybe forward at a climb. You know how the British call it a skip bomb. When they drop ordnance on water, they use the surface to guide it into ships. This," Alan pressed his boot into the sand, "is our ocean." Frank studied him for a long time. The kid wasn't crazy, just tired enough to see patterns where others saw hopelessness. "All right," he said finally, "you get one shot." They positioned the tank 30 yards from a low dune, the barrel angled down. Alan calculated on his notepad, lips moving silently. 20 degrees incline, damp sand, distance 200 yards. The shell should lift at about 15 feet. If I'm wrong, it just digs a new hole. Frank keyed the intercom. Driver lock, brakes. "Gunner 1 practice round, aim for the base of the slope, fire on my mark." The loader slammed the shell into the breech. The gunner looked at Frank through the dim red glow of the instrument panel, uncertain. Frank nodded. "Fire." The recoil thundered across the valley, a flat, sharp crack that echoed between the dunes. For a moment, nothing. Then, 50 yards ahead, a burst of dust exploded higher than expected, followed by a metallic clang echoing faintly from the distance. Both men froze. "Did you hear that?" Alan asked. Frank lowered his binoculars. That wasn't just sand. They walked forward, cautiously, boots sinking into soft ground. When they reached the impact zone, they found the entry scar where the shell had struck. The angle was shallow, the groove long and smooth. Then it disappeared halfway up the dune. Frank scanned ahead with his flashlight. 100 yards farther, a dent glimmered on the side of an abandoned fuel drum. The shell had bounced. Alan dropped to his knees, examining the furrow. "You see this?" he whispered. The sand compacted under impact. It acted like a spring, not a cushion. The round skimmed up instead of sinking. Frank stared at the drum. The idea seemed insane, and yet there it was. Proof carved in steel. "You're telling me we could use the desert itself to redirect our shots?" Alan smiled for the first time in days. "If we can aim it. If we can calculate the right slope and distance." They returned to the tank and repeated the test twice more. The second shot skipped even higher, missing the drum, but leaving a perfect arc in the sand. The third struck the drum dead center, punching clean through. The sound rang across the valley like a church bell made of iron. Frank exhaled slowly. "That's not luck." "No," Alan said quietly. "That's physics." The next morning, while the rest of the unit prepared for another grim day, Frank and Alan presented their findings to the platoon commander. Lieutenant Harris listened, half amused, half irritated. "So you're telling me you want to waste shells, bouncing them off the ground?" Alan didn't flinch. "Not waste. Multiply. The ricochet adds trajectory. The side armor on a Panzer is weaker 80 millimeters. If we hit from a low angle, the penetration improves." Harris shook his head. "We're not artillery theorists, Private. We're tankers. We shoot straight." "Straight doesn't work," Frank cut in. "We've been shooting straight for a week, sir. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and we're losing every engagement. If we're going to die, I'd rather die trying something that makes sense." The lieutenant hesitated. The desperation in Frank's voice wasn't rebellion, it was realism. Finally, Harris sighed. "You get one engagement to prove it. After that, you follow orders." Allen scribbled notes, furiously refining the angle and range. "We'll use the next engagement as a field test. The sand here is dense from yesterday's rain, perfect for deflection." Frank glanced toward the east, where the first orange rays were sliding over the dunes. He felt the familiar pulse of fear mixed with something new curiosity. They had spent weeks being prey. Now, for the first time, they had a trick. He rested a hand on the warm steel of the gun barrel. If this works, the desert stops being their advantage. It becomes ours. Allen looked up from his notebook, eyes glinting behind the dust. "Let's make the sand fight back." That night the camp was quieter than usual. The men cleaned their weapons and wrote letters home they might never send. But Frank couldn't sleep. He replayed the metallic sound of that shell bouncing off the drum, the impossible clang echoing across the empty valley. He realized what it meant not just for them, but for anyone trapped on the wrong side of better technology. He whispered to himself, "War isn't won by who shoots first. It's won by who figures it out first." March 23, 1943. The first light of dawn crept over the ridgeline east of El Gueter, turning the desert into an ocean of bronze. The wind was calm for once, and the sand lay smooth and silent, like it was waiting to see who would bleed into it next. Frank Miller's tank Iron Saint sat half-buried behind a dune, its engine idling low, exhaust mixing with the morning chill. Through the vision slit, Frank could see his own breath fogging against the steel. The world outside was orange and still, but not for long. Intelligence had warned that Rommel's armor was on the move again. They were coming from the northeast with nearly 40 Panzers, mostly Mark IVs, a few self-propelled guns, and at least one Tiger. The Americans had less than half that number, many already damaged. No one said it aloud, but every man inside those Shermans knew what the odds meant. The last time they faced the Afrika Korps in open ground, it hadn't been a battle. It had been a slaughter. Frank adjusted his headset, his throat dry. "All units hold fire until my mark. Keep low engines ready." His voice stayed calm, but his hands were trembling. Allen sat beside him, notebook open on his lap, running his finger down the hastily drawn chart. "Target angle 22 degrees, he whispered. "We'll use the slope ahead as the deflection surface. Range 300 yards. Firing depression -6. Frank nodded. "If we live through this, you're getting a math book named after you." The radio crackled. Panzer column sighted. Grid 7-2. 2 Tigers confirmed. The line went quiet except for static. Then came the low hum of engines, distant at first, then growing a chorus of mechanical growls echoing through the valley. The ground began to tremble. Frank's loader swore under his breath. "They're coming fast." "Good," Frank said. "Let 'em think we're retreating again." Through the binoculars, he saw them appear, gray shapes cresting the ridge in perfect formation dust, curling behind like smoke from a factory line. German discipline, German precision. The sunlight caught the crosses on their hulls, and for a second the entire ridge looked metallic, alive. The lead Tiger stopped, turret rotating. Even at this distance, Frank could feel the menace in its movement. "Steady," he whispered. "Wait for the ridge to shadow them." The Panzer column advanced another 50 yards. The first shell came from their right flank, an 88mm shriek that tore the silence apart and slammed into the ground 50 yards short of their position. The shockwave hit the Sherman like a hammer. Sand exploded around them, raining down through the open turret hatch. "Jesus, that was close!" the driver shouted. Frank leaned into the mic. "Driver forward 10 yards. Gunner load HE. Allen confirmed slope angle." Allen glanced through the periscope, measuring by instinct more than math. "Looks right. Just don't aim at them. Aim at the dirt in front of them." Frank grinned without humor. The one time in my life that missing on purpose might save us. The German tanks continued firing the air now, alive with concussions. Each blast sent waves of heat through the cockpit, shaking bolts loose, filling the intercom with static. But the smoke also gave them cover. Frank saw his moment. "Loader ready round." Loaded. Target the base of that dune, range 250, fire. The gun kicked like a living thing. The shell streaked low, slammed into the sand slope, and vanished. A heartbeat later, a sharp flash erupted halfway up the hill behind the panzers. One of the German tanks jerked sideways, smoke belching from its side armor. "What the hell did that just—" the loader started, voice breaking. "It worked," Alan whispered. "It actually worked." Frank didn't wait. "Reload? Adjust 5 degrees left, same angle." The second shot went out, and again the desert answered. The shell skimmed off the hard sand, ricocheted up and struck the second panzer in the track assembly. Sparks bloomed like fireworks. The tank slewed to a stop, crew bailing out into the open. By now the Germans were confused. The shots weren't coming from where they expected. They fired toward the ridgeline, toward the smoke, toward anything that moved, but the ricochet angles made it look as if the shells were coming from below them, from the ground itself. The platoon radio exploded with chatter. "Miller? What in God's name are you doing down there? Those hits are from your sector." Frank keyed the mic. "Call it desert geometry, sir. Recommend everyone start aiming low." Within minutes, 2 other Shermans joined in adjusting their aim based on Frank's coordinates. The battlefield became chaos. German tanks shifted position, exposing their weaker sides, trying to track invisible enemies. Every time they moved, another American round skipped out of the sand, striking from a new direction. The desert had turned traitor. The Tiger finally fired its shell, screaming over their heads and detonating behind them. The blast wave through sand and rock, through the open hatches. Frank's ears rang. Alan's voice was faint through the static. "That one's too high. He can't see us." Frank grabbed the radio again. "All units focus on that Tiger. Use the ricochet angle. Front dune 200 yards out. Aim for his belly." The Shermans fired in sequence, each shot skipping, screaming, disappearing into dust. One round struck short, another went wide. Then the third skipped perfectly its tracer line, cutting a sharp arc before slamming into the Tiger's lower hull. The explosion was instant. The massive tank shuddered fire, blooming from its underside, black smoke twisting into the pale sky. Inside Iron Saint, the crew sat in stunned silence. No one cheered. They just stared through the vision slit at the impossible sight, a Tiger burning from below. Frank exhaled slowly, voice quiet. "You just rewrote tank warfare, Alan." The kid smiled weakly, eyes shining with disbelief. "No, Sarge. The sand did." More explosions echoed to the north. Other units were picking up on the trick. Frank could hear them over the radio, laughter shouts, commands blending into chaos. "They're skipping shells. It's working, holy hell. It's actually working." By noon, the battle turned. The German line began to falter. Without clear visibility and under relentless fire from unpredictable angles, the Africa Corps pulled back toward the hills. What started as another hopeless defense had become a reversal so sudden it felt unreal. When the shooting finally stopped, the battlefield was quiet again. The smell of burned oil mixed with desert wind. Frank climbed out of the hatch and stood on the tank's hull. He could see wrecked panzers smoking in the distance, dark scars on an endless sea of sand. Alan joined him, still holding his notebook. "You realize no one's going to believe this?" "They will," Frank said, "when they see the holes." He looked out across the dunes, their surfaces carved with long, smooth grooves, proof that even sand, given the right angle, could strike back. The desert was quiet again, the kind of silence that felt suspicious. Smoke drifted lazily from the wrecks curling above the dunes like dark ribbons. Frank sat on the turret of Iron Saint, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't yet found a way out of his body. Below him, the crew moved in slow motion, dazed, as if afraid to believe what they'd just survived. The wind began to pick up scattering ashes across the sand, erasing evidence, even as the heat from the burning tanks still radiated. He pulled off his helmet, listening. No incoming rounds, no engines. Just the faint crackle of fire and the thump of his own heartbeat. The air smelled of cordite oil and scorched metal, an odor that clung to uniforms and skin for days. The battle at El Guitar was over. Somehow, against every calculation, they had won. Alan climbed out of the turret, his face streaked with grime, his eyes bloodshot but alive. "We did it, Sarge." Frank looked across the plain. 21 German tanks were burning or abandoned, their tracks, twisted hulls, breached. The Tiger lay crippled out on its side, smoke billowing from its belly, its gun pointing uselessly toward the horizon. "We did something," Frank said quietly. "I'm not sure what you call it yet." Back at the temporary command post, officers crowded around the battle map in disbelief. Reports were coming in multiple enemy vehicles destroyed by unusual trajectories. Radio operators repeated the same phrases: impacts from below, skip fire effect. Ricochet strikes confirmed. No one had heard of such a thing before. A colonel from headquarters demanded clarification, his voice rising over the static. "Are you telling me our men are bouncing shells off the sand now?" "Yes, sir," came the reply. "And it's working?" The rumor spread faster than the smoke. Crews from nearby battalions rode in after dark, drawn by the story of the bouncing shots. They walked among the wrecks with flashlights, inspecting the clean holes in the Panzer's sides, the strange upward entry angles. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others just stood silent, tracing the scorch marks with their fingers like archaeologists uncovering a miracle. One mechanic muttered, "Hell, maybe we should start calling the kid Einstein." Alan didn't smile. He was sitting beside a broken half-track, scribbling new equations into his notebook. It wasn't genius, he said when Frank approached. It was desperation that happened to make sense. Frank sat beside him, watching the fires burn low. "That's the difference, kid. Most people stop thinking when they're desperate." For the next 3 days, the Americans consolidated their position. Engineers recorded the ricochet angles. Ammunition officers analyzed the shell impacts, and field manuals began quietly updating their appendices. The phenomenon was logged under indirect deflection fire, but among the tankers, it had a simpler name: the bounce. Everywhere Frank went, men wanted to know how it worked. He explained it as best he could: the right slope, the right range, the right type of sand. But what he couldn't explain was the feeling in that moment before the first shot hit, the sense that something invisible had shifted, that for the first time the battlefield was listening to them, not the other way around. 3 days later, a staff jeep arrived from Corps headquarters. Out stepped a major with dust on his boots and disbelief in his eyes. He asked to see the gunner. Alan stood at attention, sweat cutting streaks through the dirt on his face. The major extended a hand. "Private, you may have just changed the way we fight in this desert." Alan looked at his hand before shaking it. "Sir, I just did the math." The major nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." By April, reports of similar ricochet hits began appearing in dispatches from other units. Some were accidental, others intentional. At first, they called it luck. Then, as the pattern repeated, the commanders started calling it innovation. What began as a desperate idea in one tank became part of tactical briefings across the theater. The principle spread: adjust your shot truss to the ground. Let the terrain work for you. Frank and Alan's unit was rotated to maintenance duty near Gafsa in early April. It should have been a reprieve, but the war never gave real rest. During a routine convoy escort, a German Stuka squadron caught them exposed on a ridgeline. The air erupted in explosions. By the time the smoke cleared, Alan's tank was gone, a twisted shell half buried in sand. Frank found his notebook 2 days later, its pages singed but legible. The last thing written wasn't an equation. It was a single line in pencil, faint but deliberate. "Even sand can learn to fight back." He kept the notebook in his breast pocket for the rest of the war. Months later, when the official after-action report of El Gueter was published, one small paragraph mentioned experimental indirect gunnery techniques resulting in successful flank penetrations. There were no names attached. There rarely were. But the veteran crews knew the story. When young replacements joined, they'd tell it again in the dark, by the rumble of idling engines, how one gunner figured out how to make the desert itself fight for him. Frank finished the war in Italy, commanding a platoon of Shermans. He never spoke much about El Gueter, but every time he saw a new recruit adjusting elevation on the gun sight or an engineer testing shell trajectories against sloped terrain, he smiled to himself. He understood now what Alan had meant, that the real battle wasn't for land or machines, but for ideas. He once wrote in a letter to his wife, "The Germans had precision, we had imagination." And in the end, imagination was the sharper weapon. When the war finally ended and the world moved on to rebuild, Frank returned home to Michigan. He worked as a mechanic for years before becoming an instructor at an armored training school. He kept Alan's notebook on his desk, its cover faded and stained with sand. On the first page in his own handwriting, he added one sentence: "Wars are not won by the best weapons, but by the minds that refuse to stop thinking." That line would later appear in a training pamphlet for the U.S. Army Armored Corps printed without credit. It didn't need one. The men who had fought at El Gueter already knew who had said it first. As for the desert, it erased everything in time, the tracks, the wrecks, even the bones. But if you stood there long enough, you could still hear echoes carried on the wind, not of gunfire but of a single ricochet, the impossible sound of a bullet that learned how to change direction. By the time the North African campaign ended in May 1943, the world had already forgotten how close it had come to disaster. Newspapers back home spoke of victory of American tanks outsmarting the Desert Fox, of a new generation of soldiers proving themselves on foreign soil. But the men who had been there, who had felt the desert's heat through steel and the tremor of artillery through their bones, knew the truth. Victory wasn't born from superiority, it was born from survival, and survival came from thinking faster than you were supposed to. Frank Miller's platoon was reassigned to Sicily later that summer. The new men who joined them brought stories about ricochet tactics taught during their briefings. They spoke of it like legend, an innovation attributed to some anonymous unit in Tunisia that had turned sand into a weapon. Frank never corrected them. He just nodded and told them to aim low when the ground was soft. The manuals were already changing. Buried in an appendix under field firing notes, armored engagements in desert terrain, was a short paragraph about angular ricochet and deflection-enhanced penetration. It read like a physics paper more than a combat doctrine, but Frank smiled when he saw it. Somewhere a young gunner would read those words and realize that rules were written by survivors, not by scholars. In the evenings, Frank would sit by his tank and flip through Alan's notebook. The pages were stiff with dried sweat and fuel stains. Between equations and sketches there were notes about the men they had lost, initials, dates, places where the sand had swallowed too many names. Alan had kept count. Every entry was precise, almost clinical, until the last one. The one Frank had found after the Stuka attack. Even sand can learn to fight back. He traced the line with his finger, and for the first time since the battle, he let himself believe it wasn't just about shells and angles. It was about men who refused to give up learning even when death was already halfway there. The war pushed on to Italy, then France, and finally across the Rhine. Everywhere the Americans went, they met new challenges, mud instead of sand, fog instead of sunlight, but the principle remained the same. When doctrine failed, think harder. When weapons failed, change the geometry. Frank became known as the sergeant who taught combat math, a nickname that started as a joke but soon stuck. His men learned to see landscapes differently, not as obstacles but as tools. Hills became mirrors, rivers became shields, and terrain stopped being the enemy. After the war, Frank was offered a teaching post at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where the Army tested new armor and gunnery methods. He accepted not because he wanted to relive the past, but because he believed the lesson wasn't finished. He began each class the same way by drawing a single equation on the board: trajectory equals velocity times sine of the angle. Then he'd put down the chalk and say, "That's the difference between life and death when you're out of options." He never mentioned El Gueter by name. He never talked about Alan. But every time he ran his hand across the chalkboard, leaving faint white streaks on his fingers, he thought about the sand grooves carved by ricochet shells, the first battlefield blackboard that had ever taught him anything. Years later, historians writing about North Africa would focus on the generals Patton, Rommel, Montgomery, their maneuvers, their supply lines, their victories. The reports would call El Gueter a turning point, a strategic success. that paved the way for Italy. What they never mentioned was that part of that turning point had begun with two men, one idea, and the courage to aim wrong on purpose. In 1946, Frank received a letter from the Army's Department of Research and Development. Enclosed was a copy of a new training pamphlet titled Adaptation in Armored Warfare. On the inside cover, a quote read, "Wars are not won by better machines, but by better thinking." There was no author. Frank smiled. It didn't matter. The words had found their way home. That night he took a long walk outside his workshop. The world was quiet, the air cool and clean, nothing like the burning wind of Tunisia. He looked up at the stars, the same ones he had watched through the hatch of his Sherman, and for a moment the years fell away. He could still hear the ricochet, one metallic note ringing across the desert like a lesson written in sound. He whispered into the night, "You were right, Alan. Even the sand can learn." And for a brief second he swore the wind answered back. In the end, history forgot their names, but it remembered their math. Every soldier who adjusted an angle or questioned an order carried a fragment of that legacy, even if they never knew it. Because every battlefield, then or now, still asks the same question: what happens when everything you know stops working? For Frank, the answer had always been simple. You think, you adapt, you survive. If you believe that wars are decided more by minds than by weapons, comment 1. If you still think firepower wins alone, comment 0. Decades later, the desert looks almost untouched. The wind has covered the scars of tracks and explosions, smoothing the land back into silence. Only when the sun sets low enough do the ghosts return. Long shadows stretching across the dunes, whispering of machines that once clawed their way across this same sand. The battlefield of El Guetar has no monuments, no markers, just a few twisted fragments of metal, half buried in gold dust. But if you listen long enough, you can still hear something faint, the echo of a ricochet, the metallic heartbeat of an idea that refused to die. Frank Miller returned once, years after the war. He was older then, slower in his step, but the desert greeted him like an old rival. He walked until the wind erased his footprints, stopping near the place where Iron Saint had stood that morning in 1943. The air smelled exactly as he remembered, dry, metallic, ancient. He knelt and ran a handful of sand through his fingers. It glittered briefly, catching the light the same way it had when it turned one impossible shot into a lifeline. He smiled faintly. Still here, he said to the ground, still fighting. He knew the war would always be remembered for its grand strategies, its generals, its victories carved into textbooks. But beneath all that noise, it was the small acts of defiance that truly defined it, the moments when ordinary men refused to accept the math of defeat. That's what the ricochet had been. Not a miracle, not a trick, but a refusal. A refusal to surrender the last inch of imagination to fear. Frank never wrote a book, he never told his story on camera. But every year when cadets at Fort Knox studied adaptive tactics, they learned about a nameless crew in North Africa who turned geometry into survival. No one mentioned his name, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere some young soldier was learning that even when the odds say you're finished, there's always another angle left to find. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank stood and looked one last time at the endless sand. The light turned red, then violet, then faded into darkness. The desert was quiet, but not dead. The wind brushed against his coat, carrying a sound that might have been memory, might have been imagination, a faint ringing note like steel striking steel. He turned toward the setting sun and whispered, "The desert still remembers." And maybe it does, because some sounds never fade. They just travel farther, bouncing endlessly like that one impossible shot that proved even the weakest ground can fight back when someone dares to think differently. If you believe that courage begins the moment you start thinking for yourself, comment 1. If you think courage only belongs to those who follow orders, comment 0. October 1943. The sky over Germany was filled with burning bombers. Formation after formation of B-17 flying fortresses limped home with engines smoking, wings shredded, and crews missing. On that same day, in a quiet corner of an airfield half a world away, a single fighter sat covered in dust. Its sleek frame hinted at speed, but the sign on its fuselage told a different story. Rejected unsuitable for high-altitude operations. To most men, it was a dead end. To one mechanic, it was unfinished business. He was neither a general nor a designer, just a 30-year-old test pilot and engine specialist named Ronald Harker. He had no authority to touch the aircraft, no permission to modify it, and every reason to leave it alone. But what he saw that day would push him to defy the entire chain of command. At that moment, the air war over Europe was hanging by a thread. American bombers were flying deeper into Germany every week, and the escort fighters that were supposed to protect them were forced to turn back hundreds of miles too soon. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning could fight brilliantly, but only for a few hours. Beyond 250 miles, the bombers were alone, easy prey for the Luftwaffe's waiting claws. Crews were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Reports from the 8th Air Force were brutal. 1 in 4 bombers lost 600 men missing in a single day. The generals knew they needed a new fighter, something that could fly to Berlin and back, but every proposal ended the same way. Too slow, too heavy, too late. And so the Army Air Forces turned their eyes away from a small, forgotten aircraft built by North American Aviation. The P-51 Mustang had been written off as a mediocre low-altitude fighter crippled by its American-made Allison engine that gasped for air above 15,000 feet. Its test results were so disappointing that procurement officers ended production plans entirely. On paper, it was a failure. On the hangar floor, Harker saw potential. He understood what the reports had missed. The problem wasn't the airframe, it was the heartbeat inside it. Harker had spent years testing the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine that roared at 30,000 feet where the Allison suffocated. He knew its twin-stage supercharger could transform any aircraft built around it. If he could combine the Merlin's lungs with the Mustang's perfect frame, he might create the long-range escort that generals had only dreamed about. There was only one problem: no one had asked for his opinion, and acting on it would be illegal. Yet wars are rarely won by men who play safe. In secret, Harker planned an unauthorized test flight, one that would break regulations, chain of command, and diplomatic protocol between two nations. If he was wrong, it would end his career. If he was right, it might end the slaughter over Germany. In the coming months, his illegal idea would shake both the British and American Air Forces to their core and give birth to the fighter that would change the war itself. So before we continue, ask yourself this: when rules stand between innovation and survival, which would you choose? If you believe that sometimes breaking the rules saves lives, type 1 in the comments. If you believe orders must always come first, hit like to stand by discipline. And make sure to subscribe, because the next part will reveal how one forbidden flight rewrote aviation history. By the autumn of 1943, the skies over Europe had become graveyards of aluminum. What began as the proud promise of daylight precision bombing was collapsing under the weight of statistics that no one in Washington wanted to read aloud. Between August and October, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 2,000 bombers. In a single raid over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 60 flying fortresses were torn apart in less than 8 hours. 600 airmen never came home. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10. Each crew represented months of training, hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment, and 10 families who would soon receive a telegram that began with the same phrase: "We regret to inform you." The numbers were merciless. A bomber group needed to complete 25 missions before its men could rotate home, but by the winter of 1943, the average life expectancy of a crew was 11 missions. Flying over Germany had become a sentence of slow execution. The enemy knew it too. German radar and fighter control stations tracked American formations the moment they crossed the Channel. Waves of Messerschmitt 109S and Focke-Wulf 190 waited in ambush along the return routes. They attacked in coordinated groups of 30 or 40, cutting through bomber formations like knives through paper. At high altitude, with no fighter cover left, the lumbering B-17S were helpless. The American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, were masterpieces of engineering, but they were prisoners of fuel. The P-47, powered by a massive radial engine, could reach 30,000 feet and dive faster than any German plane, yet its range was limited to barely 475 miles. The P-38, elegant and deadly in the Pacific, struggled with freezing temperatures and engine reliability over Europe. Both could escort the bombers across the coast, maybe as far as the Ruhr Valley. But the targets that mattered, Berlin, Leipzig, Regensburg, lay more than 550 miles away. The moment the escorts turned back, the Germans moved in for the kill. Every commander knew this was unsustainable. The Air Force tried to compensate with drop tanks and fuel-saving formations, but nothing changed the basic arithmetic of survival. Without a fighter that could go the distance, the daylight bombing campaign would have to stop. The British, having learned that lesson the hard way in 1941, had switched entirely to night raids. The Americans refused. They still believed in the promise of daylight precision that they could cripple German industry without destroying German cities. But precision meant visibility, and visibility meant death. Inside the Pentagon, committees produced endless reports filled with charts, graphs, and acronyms. Every solution was met with a new obstacle: production schedules, supply chains, fuel allocation, political pressure. Engineers proposed radical designs, but procurement officers dismissed them as too expensive or unproven. The system valued reliability over risk. Innovation was something to be discussed, not implemented. In meeting rooms filled with cigar smoke and fear, the answer to every question was another delay. On the ground, the mood was darker. Pilots were running out of faith. In debriefing tents, they spoke quietly about missions that ended with half their friends missing. A gunner from the 100th Bomb Group described seeing entire squadrons erased from the sky. It was like watching paper burn, he said. They went up in flames, and then there was just empty air. The Air Force called it the Black Week of October. For the men who flew it, it was proof that leadership had failed them. And still somewhere in England, a few officers whispered about a forgotten aircraft built by North American Aviation, a plane with unmatched aerodynamics but a heart too weak to breathe thin air. The P-51 Mustang had been dismissed as a tactical curiosity, a low-altitude scout with no future in the European theater. But among test pilots and engineers, rumors were spreading. They said the frame was perfect, the lift-to-drag ratio near revolutionary, the handling smooth as silk. If only it had the right engine, it could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything in the sky. Officially, the project was dead. Unofficially, hope was stirring in the back rooms of hangars and workshops. That hope would soon find its champion, a mechanic who didn't care about paperwork or permission. The man who would prove that innovation doesn't come from the top of the chain of command, but from the hands of those who were closest to the machines themselves. If you were in his position seeing men die because of bureaucracy, would you break the rules to save them? Type 2 in the comments if you take that risk. Or hit like if you believe that no one is above the chain of command. On April 30th, 1943, at RAF Duxford, in Cambridgeshire, the air was thick with the smell of oil and spring rain. Mechanics were servicing a squadron of Allison-powered Mustang Mark. Is their olive-drab fuselages streaked with mud from low-level reconnaissance runs over occupied France? The aircraft were good at what they did, fast below 15,000 feet, agile in ground attack, but every pilot in the hangar knew the same bitter truth. Once the fight moved higher, the Mustang suffocated. It was fast enough to chase trains, not Messerschmitts. That afternoon, a visitor arrived from Rolls-Royce's test division at Hucknall. His name was Ronald Harker, a 30-year-old engine specialist known for his precision and for occasionally ignoring protocol. Officially, he was there to observe engine wear under combat conditions. Unofficially, he was chasing a question that had been haunting him for months. Could the perfect airframe be rescued by a better heart? The squadron commander, half joking, offered him a flight. "Go ahead, take one up," he said. Just don't expect miracles. No one expected the civilian engineer to find anything new. Harker climbed into the narrow cockpit, the smell of metal and fuel heavy in the air, and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang leapt off the grass runway with the smoothness of a bird long caged. At 15,000 feet, the Allison engine began to gasp, just as the pilots had warned. But what struck Harker wasn't the weakness, it was everything else. The control harmony was perfect. The fuselage sliced through the air with almost no vibration. The wings, built around a new laminar flow profile, generated lift with astonishing efficiency. It was in every way that mattered the ideal body for a high-altitude fighter. It simply needed an engine that could breathe. Harker had spent years living and working beside the Merlin, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged masterpiece that powered Britain's Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mosquitoes, and Lancasters. He knew its temperament, its hunger for precision, its raw potential above 30,000 feet. The Merlin produced nearly 420 horsepower at altitudes where the Allison struggled to make 1,000. As he descended through the clouds back toward Duxford, the idea crystallized in his mind with dangerous clarity. Marry the Mustang's airframe to the Merlin's lungs, and the result could rewrite the rules of air combat. It was a thought he was not allowed to have. As a Rolls-Royce employee, Harker had no authority to recommend modifications to foreign military aircraft. Any proposal to alter a Lend-Lease design required American approval through a labyrinth of committees that would take months to answer, if they answered at all. But Harker was not a man who waited for permission. Within 72 hours, he typed a detailed report addressed to Air Vice Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman at the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Dated May 3, 1943, it began with a sentence that defied both bureaucracy and diplomacy. The Mustang airframe is superior to any fighter currently in production. He went further, writing that the installation of a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 would create a fighter whose range and high-altitude performance will exceed that of any aircraft currently operational. It was, by every rule of wartime procedure, an illegal recommendation. Yet Freeman read it twice, then sent it onward with a single note. "This may be the most important report to cross my desk this year. Proceed regardless of diplomatic complications." Freeman's approval turned a forbidden idea into an act of quiet rebellion. At Hucknall, Rolls-Royce engineers began working in secret. They took a Mustang 1 serial number AL 975, technically property of the United States under Lend-Lease, and rolled it into a corner of the test hangar under guard. Mechanics stripped out the Allison V1710 and began adapting the fuselage mounts for the larger Merlin 61. It was not a simple swap. The cooling system had to be redesigned. The cowling reshaped the propeller, replaced with a 4-bladed unit to handle the extra torque. Every adjustment had to be improvised. No blueprints existed, no approvals had been granted. To the letter of the law, it was theft of foreign property. To the men in the hangar, it was salvation. They worked after hours, welding, cutting, and measuring by hand. The project was so secret that official records later referred to it only as Conversion X. When questioned, Harker described it as routine engine evaluation. In truth, he and his small team were committing the mechanical equivalent of mutiny. Each day they risked their careers and possibly imprisonment under wartime security regulations. Yet none of them stopped. They knew what was at stake: thousands of airmen's lives and the control of Europe's skies. By October 1943, after 5 months of midnight labor, the first hybrid Mustang rolled out of the hangar. The British called it the Mustang X. Under its smooth cowling purred the heart of a Spitfire. Harker climbed back into the cockpit he knew so well, checked the gauges, and advanced the throttle. The Merlin roared to life, deeper and sharper than any Allison. The prop wash blew dust across the field. As the aircraft surged forward, it lifted cleanly, climbing faster than any Mustang had ever climbed before. At 25,000 feet, Harker leveled off, pushed the throttle open, and watched the airspeed needle pass 430 miles per hour, 70 miles faster than the original. When he landed, he wrote a single sentence in his logbook: "The Merlin Mustang is the finest fighter aircraft I have ever flown." That sentence, born of defiance, would echo through every command office in Britain and America within weeks. A rule had been broken. A revolution had begun. If you were in Harker's place, knowing your act could end your career but save countless lives, what would you do Type 3 if you'd take the risk? Or hit like if you believe obedience must come before innovation? October 13th, 1943. The sky over Hucknall shimmered with a pale autumn light as a small crowd of Rolls-Royce engineers gathered at the edge of the runway. Before them stood the aircraft that shouldn't have existed, Mustang X Serial AL 975, its lines cleaner, its nose slightly longer to house the powerful Merlin engine. No official observer from the Air Ministry was present, no photographers, no public record. Only a handful of men knew that what was about to happen could either redefine air warfare or end their careers in disgrace. Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit strapped in and took a deep breath. Months of secrecy had come down to this moment. The mechanics had done the impossible, fitted an unapproved British engine into an American fighter that both governments had dismissed as a failure. The Merlin's 12 cylinders came alive with a metallic growl, smoother and more confident than the Allison's strained cough. The sound alone turned heads. As the plane accelerated down the runway, the crowd watched in silence. At barely 800 feet, the Mustang lifted, climbing at a rate that stunned even the engineers who had built it. Within minutes, it vanished into the clouds. At 25,000 feet, Harker pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin purred where the Allison would have gasped. The altimeter spun upward. The airspeed needle crossed 400, then 410, then 430 miles per hour. The controls remained steady, responsive, alive. The Mustang's laminar flow wings sliced through the air like razors. At that altitude, Harker realized what the numbers meant. The converted Mustang was now faster than the Spitfire Mark IX, the pride of the Royal Air Force. Faster, higher, and with twice the range. For a moment, he simply flew the English countryside far below the instrument dials, glowing steady green. He was flying a legend before anyone knew it existed. When he landed 40 minutes later, he climbed down with a smile that no one had seen on him before. His test report was brief and clinical, but its conclusion left no doubt. The Merlin Mustang is the finest fighter aircraft I have ever flown. Performance exceeds the Spitfire Mark IX, above 20,000 feet, while maintaining range advantage of over 200%. This aircraft should be put into production immediately. That sentence exploded through the halls of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Within days, high-ranking RAF officers were demanding verification flights. Veteran pilots took the new Mustang X aloft and returned speechless. Squadron leader Michael Robinson, a 12 Victory ace, wrote, "I have flown Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Thunderbolts in combat. The Merlin Mustang is superior to all of them, above 15,000 feet and equal below. Its range is triple the Spitfire. This is the bomber escort fighter we've been waiting for." But the reaction across the Atlantic was very different. When data from the British tests reached Wright Field in Ohio, American procurement officers treated it with skepticism. Their memos were polite but cold. The RAF's suggestion regarding Merlin installation in the P-51 is noted, one read. However, allocation of resources for modification of a design previously rejected as unsuitable for high-altitude operations is not efficient. The message was clear: they were not interested. The bureaucracy refused to believe that their own engineers had missed something so revolutionary. National pride played its part, too. Admitting the British had improved an American aircraft was a political embarrassment. Sir Wilfrid Freeman, unwilling to wait, played his next card. Rolls-Royce's American licensee, the Packard Motor Company, was already building Merlins in Detroit for export to Britain. Freeman quietly suggested that North American aviation experiment with those American-built Merlins thereby avoiding the foreign component argument. By the time Washington realized what was happening, it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. In November 1943, North American engineers completed 2 prototype conversions in California. The first, designated NA-102, was flown by company test pilot Robert Chilton. His report mirrored Harker's almost word for word: exceptional performance at all altitudes, stable, powerful, and fast, the best single-seat fighter I have ever flown. At 25,000 feet, the American-built Merlin Mustang, now officially the P-51B, reached 440 miles per hour. It outclimbed both the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning by wide margins. Its service ceiling reached 41,000 feet. Its range, even before drop tanks, was 850 miles, nearly double any other American fighter. With 2 external tanks, it could fly 200 miles. That meant one thing. For the first time, a fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The reaction in Washington was immediate and electric. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, read the test data and sent a 1-sentence order to North American Aviation: convert all P-51 production to Merlin configuration immediately. On December 20, 1943, full-scale production of the P-51B began. Every available airframe was reassigned to the new engine. The plant at Inglewood, California, produced the P-51B, while a new facility in Dallas, Texas, built the identical P-51C. By spring 1944, over 400 aircraft per month were rolling off the line. Meanwhile, in England, the first combat-ready P-51Bs arrived with the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group. Pilots who had spent months flying the lumbering P-47S were stunned by the new aircraft's agility. On December 5, 1943, they flew their first escort mission to Amiens, France. The Mustangs reached altitude faster than the bombers they were protecting, cruised effortlessly above the formation, and when the Luftwaffe appeared, they dove with a speed and precision the Germans had never seen from an American plane. Lieutenant Charles Gumm, flying his first combat mission, shot down 2 Focke-Wulf 190s before his fuel gauge even reached half. In his combat report, Gumm wrote simply, "The P-51 does everything the P-47 does, plus it stays with the bombers all the way home. This changes everything." Everything, indeed, was about to change. For the first time in the war, Allied bombers could strike anywhere in Germany under constant fighter protection. The men who had built the Mustang X in secret could finally breathe. The illegal idea, born in defiance of regulations, had become official policy, and within months it would transform the balance of air power over Europe. If you were sitting in that test hangar watching a forbidden aircraft shatter, every record you had been told was impossible. What would you think Type 4 if you'd believed the mechanic was right all along? Or hit like if you think Luck Not Rebellion won the day? Don't forget to subscribe, because the next part reveals how this unapproved experiment turned into a weapon that saved thousands of lives. January 1944. Over the frozen skies of Europe, the sound of war began to change. The deep rumble of radial engines that had long filled the air was now joined by a sharper, cleaner tone, the growl of the Packard-built Merlin. For the bomber crews who had learned to fear the moment their escorts turned for home, the sight of those sleek new fighters glinting in the winter sun was more than comfort. It was survival. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang with the Merlin engine marked a transformation so sudden that even veterans could barely comprehend it. The 354th Fighter Group, the first to receive the new aircraft, quickly earned the nickname the Pioneer Mustang Group. In January and February 1944 alone, they claimed 155 enemy aircraft for the loss of just 14 of their own, a kill ratio of 11-1. In the same period, the older P-47 units averaged 7-1, and the P-38S 5-1. The statistics were staggering, At last, the United States Army Air Forces had a machine that could escort bombers to any target in Europe and destroy anything that challenged it. The change in strategy was immediate. When General James "Jimmy" Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, he issued an order that would redefine air combat doctrine: destroy the German Air Force wherever you find it. In the air, on the ground, or in the factory. For the first time, American fighters were no longer tethered defensively to the bomber formations. The Mustang's exceptional range and fuel efficiency gave pilots the freedom to hunt, to sweep ahead of the bombers, to engage enemy squadrons before they could organize. On February 20, 1944, Operation Argument began, better known as Big Week. It was the largest coordinated air offensive in history, over 800 bombers and 3000 fighters, targeting Germany's aircraft factories at Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, and Brunswick. For 6 days, the sky became a continuous battle of attrition. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had: Me-109, Gs, FW-190, As, and the new twin-engine Me-410A. But it was too late. The Mustangs, flying deeper and higher than any Allied fighter before them, ripped through the German defenses. On the first day of Big Week, American losses were still heavy, over 60 bombers, but Luftwaffe losses were catastrophic. In 5 days, they lost 355 fighters and 100 experienced pilots. By the end of February, German aircraft production had dropped by nearly 50%, and the Luftwaffe's operational strength was collapsing. Every time a German pilot took off, he risked meeting a P-51. The Mustang's numbers spoke louder than any speech. At 25,000 feet, it could fly at 440 miles per hour, 40 faster than the Thunderbolt, and 55 faster than the Lightning. Its climb rate exceeded 4,200 feet per minute. Its service ceiling was 41,000 feet higher than any bomber it escorted, and most critically, with internal fuel of 180 gallons plus 2 75-gallon drop tanks, its combat radius reached 800 miles. Berlin was 550 miles from England. The P-51 could fly there, fight, and return with fuel to spare. By March 1944, Mustangs were flying in mass formations alongside B-17S and B-24S over the heart of Germany. Pilots who had once flown the Thunderbolt spoke of the difference as night and day. The Mustang was lighter, more responsive, and almost telepathic in flight. It accelerated instantly, in a dive rolled effortlessly in combat, and had the precision of a surgical instrument. German aces, accustomed to the slower climbing American fighters, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who could match or exceed their every move. Major Gunter Rahl, one of the Luftwaffe's top surviving aces with over 200 victories, described his first encounter with the new American fighter. It was faster, climbed better, and handled exceptionally. Our advantage was only in armament. Their pilots were inexperienced, but they learned fast, and there were too many of them. That imbalance would soon become fatal. In March 1944, 8th Air Force bomber losses averaged 131 aircraft per month. In April, that number dropped to 70. By May, just 61. By June, when the Allies were preparing for the D-Day landings, losses had fallen to 42. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the most advanced air force in the world, was being annihilated not by sheer numbers alone, but by relentless efficiency. For every Mustang lost, the Germans were losing 10 aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. The shift in momentum was total. Mustang groups began flying fighter sweeps, independent missions, to hunt down German aircraft on the ground. Airfields across France and Western Germany were strafed daily. Trains, convoys, and even radar stations fell under the Mustang's guns. The once invincible Me-109S and FW-190S were destroyed before they could even take off. The sound of the Merlin engine over a German airfield became a warning of death. For the bomber crews, the change was almost spiritual. Before the Mustang, one B-17 pilot recalled, We flew knowing half of us wouldn't come home. After the Mustang, we started believing we might live to see the ground again. Morale soared. The psychological impact rippled through the entire 8th Air Force. For the first time since the bombing campaign had begun, air superiority was not a dream. It was reality. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed heavily armored interceptors like the Me-410 and rocket-powered aircraft such as the Me-163 Comet. They even introduced the jet-powered Me-262, but these machines came too late and too few. Mustangs patrolled the airfields where they were based, shooting them down during takeoff and landing. The Luftwaffe's production could no longer keep pace with its losses. By the summer of 1944, it was functionally broken. When Allied troops stormed Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties against 14,000 Allied flights. The sky over France belonged entirely to the Allies. P-51S roamed freely, escorting bombers, strafing columns, and providing cover for advancing troops. German ground forces looked up and saw what one soldier later called a silver sky of death. And it had all started with one forbidden modification, one man's belief that the right combination of ideas could change everything. The Mustang had become more than a fighter. It was a symbol of what happened when logic, engineering, and courage converged. Would you have believed in the Mustang before anyone else did Type 5 if you would have taken that risk? Or hit like, if you think the legend of the P-51 was just destiny, not defiance? Stay tuned. The next part reveals how this miracle machine became the enduring legacy of victory. By the spring of 1945, the sound of the Merlin engine had become the anthem of victory. Across Europe, the sky no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang. What began as a forbidden experiment in a quiet British hangar had evolved into the most successful air weapon of the Second World War. The numbers told the story with brutal precision. Over 15,575 Mustangs were built. They destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another 4,000 on the ground. In less than 2 years, they had achieved what no other fighter in history had done: complete control of the air over an entire continent. Their pilots became legends. Major George Preddy, who scored 26.8 victories before being killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day 1944, called the Mustang the fighter pilot's dream. Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, achieved 24 kills in the P-51, while ace Francis Gabreski added 6 more to his record after switching from the Thunderbolt. A young test pilot named Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, scored 11 victories in a Mustang, 5 of them in a single day. They all agreed on one thing: the aircraft was more than a machine. It was a living extension of the pilot's will. In interviews conducted after the war, the men who flew it described the same sensation: total confidence. The Mustang could outclimb, outturn, and outrun almost anything. It was fast enough to pursue fleeing Messerschmitts, yet stable enough to line up a perfect shot. Its cockpit offered a 360-degree field of vision through the bubble canopy, a first for American fighters. It could dive like a Thunderbolt cruise for hours and absorb damage that would have crippled lesser planes. Captain Donald Lopez recalled limping home from a mission with 67 bullet holes, including hits to his rudder and aileron. It flew like it was angry, he said, but it flew. The Mustang's loss rate told its own story. Out of more than 15,000 built, only about 2,500 were lost in combat, a rate of 16%, far lower than other fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt lost nearly 23% of its production, and the P-38 Lightning about 17%. In the cold logic of war, the Mustang was not only deadly, it was efficient. It delivered more kills per loss, more range per gallon of fuel, and more victories per pilot than any other Allied aircraft of the conflict. But beyond the statistics, the Mustang symbolized something deeper: the triumph of innovation over inertia. It was proof that the greatest breakthroughs often come from those willing to question authority. Ronald Harker's unauthorized flight, his illegal recommendation, and Sir Wilfrid Freeman's quiet defiance of protocol had combined to produce the fighter that won the air war. Without them, the Allied bombing campaign might have collapsed, D-Day might have failed, and the war in Europe might have lasted years longer. When the war ended in May 1945, Mustangs flew in victory parades across London and Paris. The same aircraft that had once been rejected as unsuitable now escorted surrendering Luftwaffe planes to Allied bases. The image was poetic. The hunters of 1943, now humbled, led in by the machine they had once dismissed. General Henry Hap Arnold later wrote, "The Mustang was the right airplane in the right place at the right time, but it was also the result of men who refused to accept that the system's answer was the final word." After the guns fell silent, the Mustang story did not end. It served in Korea as a ground attack aircraft, striking with the same precision and endurance that had made it famous. In the following decades, nations across the world from Sweden to Israel, from South Africa to Indonesia, used Mustangs in their own air forces. Some remained in service well into the 1980s. Today, over 150 survive in flying condition, their polished aluminum gleaming at air shows, their engines echoing across runways with that unmistakable Merlin roar. Yet the true legacy of the Mustang lies not in museums or flight demonstrations, but in the lesson it carries. Innovation rarely comes from the top. It comes from the workshop, the test hangar, the stubborn mechanic who refuses to accept failure. The story of Ronald Harker reminds us that progress is born from defiance, the courage to challenge accepted limits, to trust evidence over hierarchy, and to act when others only talk. His flight, unauthorized and illegal, changed not only aviation history, but the outcome of a world war. In every war, there are moments when the right decision is also the forbidden one, when breaking the rules is the only way to win. The P-51 Mustang stands as the shining proof of that truth. It was built in 120 days, rejected by bureaucracy, resurrected by a mechanic who refused to obey, and ultimately crowned the deadliest fighter in the American arsenal. The aircraft that had been dismissed as a failure became the guardian angel of thousands of bomber crews, the sword that cut through the heart of the Luftwaffe, and the symbol of Allied air supremacy. When you hear the thunder of a Merlin engine at an air show today, remember what it represents. It's not just the sound of horsepower and engineering. It's the echo of one man's courage to defy the system of an idea so illegal it had to be right. It's the sound of innovation taking flight of the moment when the impossible became reality. If you believe that courage and curiosity can change history, type 6 in the comments. If you think that rules must always come first, press like, and remember, every rule ever written was once broken by someone who dared to imagine something better.